what I'm trying to do is provide hope, but also to be honest. And I think one way to do that, and this just goes to our spirited conversation, is to go back in time and imagine what it's like in these different moments and what it felt like. And I think it did feel similar. 1798, 1799, the opposition party is being shut down. All of the allies are being prosecuted. These citizens fight back, they call out the authoritarian threat, and then they succeed in electing a recovery president. The presidency is the risk, but also is the thing that brings us back. But that, I want listeners to see we're going to come through it. You have not been silenced. I have not been silenced so far. See where we are next week. And I think that should give us strength.
This is Black Man Spy.
Hi, I'm Malcolm Nance, and this is Black Man Spy. This week's guest is, he doesn't say professor, but he should be, or doctor, is Corey Brettschneider, professor at Brown University, where he teaches constitutional law and politics. He has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Time magazine. He is author of The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy, and The Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. He is host of the podcast, The Oath in the Office, along with last week's guest, John Fugelsang, who is just incredible. And we are going to have a rousing discussion about American democracy in the past, threats to it now, and whether the movie Idiocracy or The Sopranos is playing out at the current moment. So let's welcome Corey Brettschneider to Black Man Spy. Corey Brettschneider, welcome to Black Man Spy, the podcast where you cry most of the time, and then every once in a very great while, we get to have a laugh. And I was just talking before you came on about how your awesome new book, right? The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. And I jokingly said, you're going to have to write a new book. Yeah, I have some news for you. There will not be 5, the citizens who fight to defend for it. Maybe you're going to have to write a book called We're Screwed, how American democracy ended and how 320 million Americans couldn't stop it if they wanted to. So that being where we kick off, this week has been arguably one of the darker weeks in not in American history, but I think that as historians will look at it, they'll view this as a, pardon the pun, turning point due to the assassination of Charlie Kirk, which has now seemingly kicked off a campaign by Donald Trump and his administration to pretty much just end American democracy. What do you think?
That's why I wrote the book. I think that I saw that in Trump's first term, and we're really seeing it now because he's learned a lot of his lessons. I had another book. It's now a podcast called The Oath in the Office, and right. I still believe in those ideals in that book of everything that we should expect from a president who, after all, the job description is in Article 2, takes an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, the rule of law. And as you said, quite rightly, we have a president now who's threatening it. But I do think this book, that I don't need a rewrite, and I'll make the argument why, because I think it does take seriously the idea that there is something very dangerous, not just at moments in American democracy, but in the structure of it. And what we're seeing now is frightening, but it is really what we've seen before. And that's the use of this dangerous office, the president of the presidency, which people who oppose ratification of the Constitution, like Patrick Henry, warned us was a kind of loaded gun that could be used to try to destroy the entire system in the hands of a non-virtuous person. Right. Essentially predicted this kind of idea. And so what we've seen in those previous 5, and we certainly have a 6th now, president who's threatening democracy, is the use of that office to really destroy some fundamental part of it. So this is part of a pattern, unfortunately. But the good news, the fortunate part, and this is why I'm hopeful, is that as bad as it was in the past, and I will make the argument that it was as bad as what we're facing now, in some ways worse. It's certain of the moments. This is not the worst that we face. It is quite serious, but in the past it has been as serious or more, and we have recovered. Never from the Supreme Court, but at the hands of, as you said, citizens who use a specific mechanism. They appeal to the United States Constitution, and they use it not through litigation, but as a way of re-electing leaders who are going to repair American democracy. So my goal, my hope in the podcast, The Oath in the Office, every week, this is what we're talking about, is to provide honesty about really why this is a threat. And actually to be honest too about the fact that in these previous 5 examples, as is true now, the government, the democracy that we think of, constitutional democracy, really could have collapsed. And it could collapse again. But even given that fragility, we did recover. And so that's where the hope comes from in looking at this. But I mean, just to make a kind of final point, it looked as dire as it does now. I'll just give you the first example. When John Adams uses the Sedition Act, a legislation on the books to prosecute political opponents, some historians, including my colleague Gordon Wood, who is a fan of Adams, and McCullough and others in that tradition, kind of downplay the Sedition Act because they didn't know the extent. The research was very weak on how it was used. We now know it was about 126 prosecutions of the main political opponents. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson, a member of the opposition party, thought he was going to be prosecuted. And just to really hit it home, the legislation enabled it. It was written for that purpose, to shut down the opposition party. So just as an example, it makes it a crime to criticize the president of the United States, but leaves it totally legal to criticize the vice president, who was the leader of the opposition party, Thomas Jefferson. So we've been here before, and we've prevailed, and that's where my hope comes from.
Well, let me challenge that thesis for a moment, because if there's any one thing that we've learned, and of course, the nature of this podcast is I come at it from a national security perspective.
Yeah.
I was a collector under the National Security Agency back when, and people at that time were saying early in the 80s, this is this enormous machine, the puzzle palace, coming after our civil rights. And as I tried to assure people for a very, very long time, until a few years ago, until this year, I would straight up say, the National Security Agency doesn't have time for you. It doesn't. Everything comes down to a human being. Everything. And it's full of little old ladies you would never notice twice at the Costco. And people who are dedicated to their oaths. And I still believe it's that way. And I believe that most of the American, and certainly the intelligence community, believes that and takes that oath very, very, very seriously. I swore an oath 6 times in my career to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. Went way out on the limb to try to get myself killed over it. And when I wrote my 2018 book, The Plot to Destroy Democracy, which was about Russia's, use of its intelligence agencies to conduct information warfare against America, I noticed a stark difference between then, of course, and now. Now, back then, if John Adams wanted to criticize one of his peers secretly through poison pen, they had to literally go and get a pen.
Yeah.
And they had to literally take time to write it. While writing it, you had time to consider what you were saying, the effect that it would take place on. It would be distributed on a news sheet, broadsheet that would be no bigger than this, or a pamphlet, and a newspaper sheet with script that was magnificently small. I actually have some original examples related to spying from the early 1800s. Hard to read. And then when you read it in the public square, or you read it, in consideration of your home. You had to be literate. And then you took time to digest and consume that. Now, a Russian hacker or a right-wing ultra extremist 16-year-old on Reddit has all the distributive power of misinformation, disinformation, and lies much greater than the New York Times.
Yeah.
So the speed of consumption and consideration, which is very important in my world, right? I mean, I have to look at facts. Now, I think has been obliterated to people don't think, they act on the first sentence.
Yeah.
And how does that impact your belief that things are going to go fine? Because we're seeing counter narrative works way faster. As you know, goddamn, Mark Twain was so far ahead of his time when he said about a lie will go 3 times around the world before the truth can turn over and put its boots on. So how do you feel we're going to be rescued with the old mechanisms in a world that moves at nanospeed?
I love the question, and I certainly wouldn't underplay the fact that in each of these 5 instances, and this 6th instance that we're talking about, the current moment, things have played out in very different ways. There are different factual universes. The threats are different. But they're also, I don't want to underplay the threats of the past because, and I think actually talking about rationality versus a kind of manipulation and lack of reason, which is a big part of the moment, the propaganda, the way that the algorithms on social media, for instance, manipulate people and how that's open to all sorts of manipulation. All of these things are very real in the moment. But I do want to just build up and show you why I think the threat was so severe before. And it really comes down to, as important as what you said is about the civil service, there is and always has been one dangerous person in the country. And the Anti-Federalists recognize that, and that's the President of the United States. And structurally, that's becoming, again, even more dangerous with the theory of the unitary executive and the assertion of control over civil servants and over independent agencies, for instance. And we've seen that danger of the singular executive, the unitary executive. We could talk more about that part of it from the beginning. And let me tell you what the threat was. It came through rationality in part, and in some ways that was what was worse. So when people talk about Adams, let's just recognize the guy has had his moment. He had a mini-series. Paul Giamatti plays him.
That. By the way, just a little extremism aside, no one flew the Appeal to Heaven sign until that show came out.
Yeah.
I mean, now it's flown as a extremist and MAGA battle flag.
Yeah. I mean, what's frightening about Adams, I'll just go into it, is that, and again, it's through rationality rather than a lack of reason. This was the premier constitutional thinker of his time. If you had to rank them, he was a good chance he's going to rank 1. He wrote books about political theory. They're usually talked about as genius. They're fine. I've read them. They're pretty good, not genius. But let me just tell you what his idea, now you'll see the threat, of the American Constitution was. He thought that far from being a rebellion against monarchy, it was a kind of perfection of constitutional monarchy. And he thought that there was an analogy between the office of the President of the United States and the British King. And in fact, he thought the British King was too constrained in his or her power. Now, when it comes to, what's the role of that in a republic? He didn't think of republic and monarchy as distinct. He thought that the president was a kind of monarch not beholden to the will of the people, who was there for a kind of stability. So when Abigail Adams, also often celebrated, comes to him and is talking about how newspaper reporters are criticizing their son, his instinct is that we've got to shut this down. And there is, again, in the open, and this is what's worse, he's not embarrassed of this. It fits with his monarchical kind of authoritarian idea of what a constitution is. And that's an idea that almost won out. Now, what about the Supreme Court, you might say, right? Like in this moment, courts have been mixed, but they are at times stopping some of the worst abuses. Why does the Supreme Court not stop something that's obviously unconstitutional, a shutdown of the opposition party? Even the vice president, the chief rival, it would be the equivalent of basically threatening Gavin Newsom with credible prosecution, not just rhetorical, take your pick, or Kamala Harris. And this passes, he signs it, and then it's used by his prosecutor, by the Attorney General, to go after opponents. 126. The crimes include the worst, supposedly. Sometimes historians talk about it as if it was really out of control rhetoric. The worst is that at one point, one of the editors calls him a hermaphroditical figure, meaning that he's two-faced.
He
And
goes
that's
both
about
ways.
as wild as it gets. Mostly it's criticizing his views about a standing army, about the threat of authoritarianism. So it almost worked. It was a shutdown of the opposition party. And speaking of secret messages, Madison and Jefferson are corresponding with each other, and it's very clear that they think they might be prosecuted, even again, the sitting vice president. So, this is a moment in which the court, not only did it not save us, but the Samuel Chase, the premier constitutional figure on the court, on the Supreme Court of the United States, not only lobbies for the laws in Congress, but actually goes and sits on the trial of Thomas Cooper, one of the editors that's being prosecuted, to make sure he can't even raise issues of free speech. We almost never had anything like constitutional democracy. It really was almost a monarchy, and a kind of monarchy in which this president wouldn't be, saying wild stuff in trying to shut down the opposition. He would have been in the tradition that Adams thought there should have been. Now, it's a very different tradition, I say, than George Washington, who talked about, likely ghostwritten by Madison, the second inaugural. I just took the oath of office. That's above me and subject me to constitutional punishment if I violate it. That's not Adams' view at all. Adams' view is I am above criticism. So that's just an example of where the rationality could have destroyed us. I'll give one other quick one, and you can go through these examples as you like. I talk about James Buchanan during the lead up to the Civil War. The country is trying to deal with the question of the enslavement of other human beings. Right. And what does Buchanan do? He lobbies the Supreme Court to deny all rights to Black Americans successfully. And that's what happens in the Dred Scott case in secret. So there again and again are these issues. They're distinct from the ones that you're rightly bringing out. And each of the moments has their own problem. One last thing about the 1798 Sedition Act is there are two realities then, too, in the way there are now. It's a different but related issue to the one you were raising. So there is the reality of the Federalists, which is France is going to invade us any day, and the reality of the Democratic Republican Party, which is a much more, familiar idea that we all have rights of free speech. And by the way, these Federalists, which they were being paranoid. So a lot of what we're seeing, the features, when you really look into the history and you see the danger that's always been the American presidency, we almost didn't recover from these moments. Each of those five, we could have been destroyed. It was very close. So I'm not making light in any way of the fact that this time the country could fail to recover, but it was true then too. But
using your example of Adams, you were talking about people, every one of them was lived contemporaneously with the founding of the nation, and every one of these individuals was actually critical in the founding of of the nation, and every one of these individuals lived under the monarchy. Yeah. Right. So would it not? I mean, it would just be part of the thought process that now that they're free of the shackles of George III, and now they're winging it on their own, right, doing it their own way, that they will make and think and consider these things thoughtfully, which we're not doing now, and let the tides of history, guide them despite what they think. We're 220 years out from that, okay? I'd have thunk that by this point, we would have pretty much gotten this down by now. But now I want to jump to your sixth, the coda in your book, talking about where we are today, because as much as I would like to believe, and certainly myself as an African-American, Dred Scott, one of the decisions that made me equal to this chair that I'm sitting into, but not equal to any other person, that it's important that we even got beyond that, and that they were crises, and apparently the American experiment moved forward. I will at some point famously do my I am a son of Philadelphia rant, where, I in high school lived and walked and breathed the American Revolution, lived all around it, and really had to think, for the first time in my life, what did those things mean to me? And I was making a decision to go into the military and in espionage, right? When I read Washington's famous words, right? Freedom is a light for which many men have died in darkness. And I thought, oh, I want to be part of this game.
Yeah.
But now that I come 220 years later, and I'm now 40 years past that point, where I've spent every living, waking moment of my life defending democracy, I see a institution, a party, and an individual who, how would I put this if I were doing very serious intelligence analysis? I would say doesn't give a flying fuck
Ah,
about,
I see.
well, by the
Well,
way,
that's
that's
an
what we
interesting
say
point.
before we write down our actual assessment. But bottom line up front, does not care about these institutions. I wrote in my book, Plot to Destroy Democracy, that Donald Trump was moving America into what I deemed a constitutional autocracy, where the Constitution is a fig leaf and it is applied to those who support him, and the rest of you are going to know what it was like to be under the Intolerable Acts. So, what
Yeah.
do you think?
Well, I think that's an important point that, even if it was a dangerous set of ideas, for instance, that Adams had or that Buchanan and Dred Scott, but at least it was principled and it was based on some notion of the rule of law. And actually, Adams himself was very fond of quoting the idea of the rule of law, not man. And so it's an interesting thesis that maybe it's more dangerous. I'll give you a counter argument. I think in some ways it's less. Because what you're dealing with in the president is somebody who's transparently selfish, has authoritarian ambitions, is a criminal, and looking out for himself. That's transparently at odds and ripe for a kind of constitutional recovery in a way that it might have been more dangerous in those other two examples that I mentioned. Because what they were providing, and it's not that Trump doesn't have people in his orbit like that, but they were providing an authoritarian philosophy to go along with their, for instance, shutdown of the opposition party in the Adams example. And he was a founder. By the way, Jefferson and Madison were fond of saying kind of like what you said, which is, what happened to this guy? He was with us when we were writing the Declaration of Independence, and now he's trying to put us in prison. And he thinks that we're essentially the enemy of the people. Not only, I should say, trying, he's doing. He
Right. Not on the verge.
They had that same
verge.
But there is something scarier about smart people, frankly, to put it that way, rather than just selfish people, creating a mechanism of authoritarian governance. And certainly, if we were to sit down with Justice Taney or Buchanan, and Buchanan would be lying to us, by the way, which goes to the part of the threat. He was telling the American people one thing, and even though it was with letters, not email or communication devices, he was definitely behind the scenes doing something very dangerous and secret. But what they were trying to do was to create a permanent enslavement of, as you well know, a large portion of the population, as you put it, to turn them into having the rights of chairs rather than of people. And they succeeded in it for a period of time. And that's why we went through a period of violence, way worse, of course, than anything that we've ever seen. The Civil War, way worse than anything that we are seeing right now. All of those things were connected to these authoritarian ambitions. They're dangerous. And the president that we can call out, who in his own party, they're starting to see, it's a little bit, Nixon, I think, was much more thoughtful than Trump is. He was a lawyer after all. He sort of could defend himself, but in the end, the philosophy was pretty close to Trump. I'm the president and I can do whatever I want. When the president does it, it's not illegal. And as much as he had this veneer, like Buchanan, of some public-facing rule of lawness, when you listen to those tapes and you do what I did in that Nixon chapter and uncover the vast network of crimes, it isn't more than a crime family. It isn't more than the mafia. The attempt to kill Daniel Ellsberg on the Capitol steps, the likely ordering of the hard hat riot, the break-in at the psychiatrist's office.
Right.
It was a criminal presidency. One of the things I come back to Patrick Henry all the time and warned us, don't ratify this thing. This is a dangerous constitution. He says the following in an amazing speech. He says, look, you're all assuming a good person in office, a person of virtue. What if you, and this really fits with Nixon, what if you have a bad person? And then he uses the phrase, what if you have a criminal president? is that, none of these things are going to work. All the checks that you think are going to happen, what will be there to stop this force? That's his phrase. And, my answer is that there almost was nothing in these examples except for us, except for the citizens calling it out, doing what you and I are doing, Malcolm, on these media shows, on television, on our podcast, on the Oath and Office, on this great podcast. We're calling it out because we're tapping into a tradition where the American people can see what's wrong with Trump. He makes it easy for us because he just tells it like it is. It's much harder to debate a James Buchanan or a John Adams or even a Woodrow Wilson, who we can talk about. They're sophisticated thinkers, and they provided a framework where even historians have really undercut, the danger that they posed to American democracy. They were authoritarians, and we have always had an authoritarian, dangerous idea of the Constitution and a democratic one. And we're seeing it again, but this time it's more transparent. The guy just tells us who he is, and I kind of like that about him.
Counterpoint. Richard Nixon was a criminal president by his own admission in many ways. The David Frost interview of when the president does it, then it's not against the law, which has set us up into it, which I consider the small snowball on the top of, white guy avalanche hill. He's like, 25 years from now, this should literally, with Roger Ailes, will literally wipe out all ability to oppose us, because we're going to ideologically harness the mindset of Americans. However, I just want to call attention to some things that I've written about in my books. One, Richard Nixon and most of the people around him were World War II combat veterans. They were, or I should say, put it this way, everyone in that era, whether it was the Supreme Court Justice or the Attorney General, everyone served and lived during World War II. And the people that came out of World War II who used the GI Bill, got their degrees, and rose to the top were very learned people. And these are people who did consider their oaths, and the word oath meant something to them. Even Nixon, you have to admit, if you're going to say that, did he uphold and protect the Constitution of the United States? Yes-ish. Yeah, you could say ish, because he wanted to push those boundaries. But when brought to him to his face that he was, as we would say in our little interrogation school accent, most fucketed, right? And he was about to be washed over by people who truly considered, right, that this was criminal and that he would have to go. He went,
in the end,
right, and actually took the honorable way out.
Well, I love this spirited debate. I'm going to definitely push back, though. And
hit me.
You've seen some of it, a lot of it in the
I'm
book.
taking notes now.
Because I do think that I think I should say that the way you're describing him, I was on, by the way, in a surreal moment on CNN on Sunday night with John Dean. And, that's somebody who I'm writing a lot about, and, a person who certainly has redeemed himself in many ways. But let's not hide from who John Dean was on the tapes. And, I have listened to a lot of pre-John Dean, and I think he would admit this. This was a criminal president, and he was surrounded by, and I'm not going to pull any punches, criminally minded people. I'll give you a story just to set it up and to set up my pushback. One of the most famous books in political science is by a professor named Neustadt, who's long passed away, but it's the sort of premier book about how presidential power works. And Neustadt tells a story in one of the follow-up editions, it was printed many times, of one of the Nixon staffers coming up to him and saying, Nixon required your book to be read by everyone on the staff, on the senior staff, and you're responsible too. And he tells this story. It's an amazing story with horror, because he says, look, I grew up with civic education. We were surrounded by the idea that the Constitution was a constraint on all public officials, including a president, certainly including civil servants. And when I talk about how a president manipulates the power of the media, the power of the bully pulpit and rhetoric, it was all within that constraint. I never talked about it because I thought it was just obvious. And then he says, I thought that this is a really interesting analysis. He says the people that Nixon surrounded himself with didn't have that education. They were educated, but they were business guys. They saw the president as a kind of CEO. And that's why a lot of the crimes happened. Now, I don't know if that's an exaggeration, but when I listen to those tapes and I hear, I'll just give you one of my most amazing moments, and I just recommend that people listen to it, because when you really hear what's going on, Ellsberg has been leaked the Pentagon Papers, and he's obviously, so much of his motivation was this irrational anger at Ellsberg. I spoke to Ellsberg at length, actually. I don't mind saying the story too, but he wanted to. He didn't respond at all to emails, but he finally did, because Mort Halperin, who supervised the Pentagon Papers, told him this guy's okay. So I got vouched for by somebody that then he came and was willing to talk. And, but so much of it was an obsession with Ellsberg. That was why it was so important that I speak to him. And when he says on the tapes, we know now what he was looking for, but he talks about Ellsberg as the main ball. We need our own Ellsberg. You see that kind of criminality. And then when you really see it, is he believed that Ellsberg had a second set of papers, the Pentagon Papers, as you know, but I'll say this for the audience, is pre-Nixon. It's largely about the Vietnam War and its failures before Nixon. So why did Nixon care so much about it? It was because he thought there was a second set of papers that was being held in the Brookings Institution in a safe. And some speculation is the safe that he's talking about is Halperin's safe.
When he ordered the break-in,
and he says it on, that's the tape, or exactly right. And when
I've heard that. That's an amazing piece of history.
And when there's pushback, this is to our main point that we're talking about. When there's pushback, Kissinger says to him at one point, he talks about it a couple of times in the tapes, but at one point, Kissinger says, well, Mr. President, if they have that material, they shouldn't have it. We should go to court. That's the rule of law. And Nixon's like, no, Henry, I want it done on this is his word, thievery basis, criminal. These guys were bad.
As amusing and as fun as that sounds, as we're considering the current administration, this is like having a conversation about, is Tony Soprano and his immediate capos in the North Jersey mob scene there, who are doing minor numbers and getting a 5% cut off of containers coming through Bayonne, as opposed to Mobutu Sese Seko or Idi Amin or Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi. These are people I've had to deal with. And this administration is not just that there is a coterie, okay? Yeah. This is, and I'm going to hark right the hell back. This is not just the top and cream of the Nazi party here. We're talking now a decade-long basis on a multi-decade campaign that has now created MAGA as an American machine where freaking everybody is part of the mindset. Part Jim Jones, all right, part David Koresh, another part's Timothy McVeigh, and then everybody else out there thinks that, that the criminality is fine, that everyone should go get a share of that, and that anyone that's not involved in this is a sucker, right? And that I believe that they're really moving their way, certainly with what has been said in the last 48 hours. If this were any other country, this is my famous if this were another country analyses in the intelligence community, we would be planning airstrikes. We really would. The United States would be going, whoa, that country's out of control. And let me point out a few of the countries we actually did that to. Iraq, Libya, Sudan, an out of control government that no longer believes in the democratic order. We have now, and just in the last few months, as you know, I was in the Ukrainian army, and and I have a president now, or a person who sits in the Oval Office in the seat behind the Resolute desk. He is not my president. I refuse to call him a legitimate president. But this person there now has aligned in his first vote earlier this year the United States with Belarus, Russia, North Korea in a resolution to block support for Ukraine. And when I see actions like that, I already know what's coming down the pike. There are no learned scholars in this administration who are using their, their education and erudition. They are out to get it for themselves. They're all on their own. They see this thing as a giant money-making machine, and I think of Richard Nixon as a quaint, small-time mafiosi, a Bugsy Malone, as compared to a Saddam Hussein, because this is now a machine to me, and I cannot break that assessment. If this were any other country, the United States no longer will consider anything within regards to human rights. The United States will no longer consider any economic development unless it personally benefits the president of the United States. This is an order of magnitude beyond Richard Nixon. And Nixon himself I know I'm ranting a little bit here. Nixon himself would say, that's a fucking thieving motherfucker. All right, I'm a small-time piker. This guy's making billions within 3 months using every lever of American power. And the only thing you and I don't have is recordings of what's going on in the White House, because as you say, they're just doing it out in public, and the entire process is designed to support them because Congress is as equally corrupt as the president. I think I think you really have maybe you just have the data for Nixon, and that since we're living through the snowball.
I'll say a couple of things, and
go on. I'm sorry.
I should say too the thesis of the book, which is part of what
you mean your new book, your next book.
No, the one that I'm defending as giving us hope in the moment, the presidents and the people. Is it part of the thesis is Trump really does combine dangers of each of these moments, but we have seen in some combination what we're seeing now before. So you see the criminality and the ambition with Nixon. You do see one other thing, which you said, and I want to just pull out for listeners, which is that so much of what we're seeing now is only possible because of the idea that when the president does it, it's not illegal, as he says to David Frost. And what he's doing there too, it's sometimes reported as like just a slip of the tongue. It's a very thought out philosophy. In the interview, he talks about the president's emergency power. He cites Lincoln. He says, by the way, and this will start to pull out, how he sees things, how he was framing it, and how he really had a lot of what's going on. He says, we are in a civil war right now. That's why I can cite Lincoln. Who are we in a civil war with? The protesters who are outside my gates, the Vietnam protesters. So when he orders, likely, and this was never proven because of the pardon, it hid this crime, but it was one of the many crimes that was being investigated at the time of the pardon, and it is part of the data. The attack in New York by construction workers and by someone who later becomes his Secretary of Labor ordering it. The attack on students that happens in which they're beaten. I mean, this is a president, at least a credible investigation of a president ordering an attack on protesters that resulted in massive beatings throughout. That's the kind of thing that was going on. Now, he didn't continue, remember, right? Trump has come back. That second term was interrupted by the arc of history, by John Dean, by the prosecution that was taking place, by the grand jury, two of whom I interviewed. They were seeing these crimes and they were able to stop it midway. Where he was going, I think, is, he did have the ambition of going in this direction. Let me say something, though, about the movement, because Nixon did not have what Trump has in the MAGA movement, and we're seeing that in real time. But there have been other moments in American history equally frightening where we had, you're describing it rightly as a kind of fascist movement, that is the kind of way the emotion of the president is connecting to citizens who are willing to do whatever to excuse his criminality in the name of his greatness or whatever it is. But let's now switch just to move around the example so we can see where the threats were there before. to 1868. The president is
Mhm.
Andrew Johnson, who
Right.
not only fails to quell violence, but incites it. He threatens violence against sitting members of Congress, pro-Reconstruction members. His desire is to bring slavery back under a different name. And throughout the country, the Ku Klux Klan and related organizations are murdering people.
Yeah.
And the election of 1868 was, there were massive numbers of murders of Black voters. And that is political violence, aside from the Civil War, it has to be way worse than anything that we're seeing at this moment.
Of course.
And the transparency, the data that we know of how vast that movement was only because in that moment of recovery, because of that election of 1868, and this is the hopeful part, Ulysses Grant creates the Department of Justice and prosecutes more than 1,000 Klansmen who are around and related to white terrorist organizations who are murdering people. So that when I say, that we've seen stuff like this before, there are different elements. The Nixonian criminality certainly is there, and that's an analogy. But the mass movement, you're right, that isn't true of the Nixon era. It is true, though, of the 19th century. So
Right.
I again,
And this, by the way,
I with you in seeing the danger. It is enormously dangerous, but it was dangerous then too. The presidency has always been dangerous. And here's what we have now. This is I'll do a little oath in the office. Hope.
God, hit me with some hope at this point, because opium is in very short supply.
What you and I are doing is we are in calling it out. We're not just giving up. We have no choice but to be hopeful. And we are drawing on the tradition of these past movements that won. If I was just like, here are these nice people that did all this great stuff, give me a break. By the way, I haven't mentioned Woodrow Wilson just to kind of, Red Summer was some of the aside from 1868, it was the worst racial violence in the United States. Wilson is out there stoking it, talking about hyphenated Americans, disloyal Americans. We've hidden all of that, partly because the Democratic Party doesn't want to admit their hero was not the first white supremacist president, and I've established that, but he was the first white nationalist president. And that was, again, like Adams, deeply embedded in his philosophy. So, Red Summer, that kind of racial violence, 1868, these are frightening moments in which it's not just a president, in Bayonne, giving orders and doing whatever Tony Soprano liked to do. It's they have a movement behind them. That's what's so scary. And Wilson, just to lay out some of what's in the book about Birth of a Nation. It's well known. He shows Birth of a Nation,
right, in the White House,
celebrating the Klan. It's based on his textbook. His roommate is the author of the Klansman. The basis for now. Can you imagine that Donald Trump had a sort of first of all, that he would write anything, but that it would outline the MAGA philosophy. I mean, that's what's dangerous about that moment. And
I think that again,
but he's not. His lack of intelligence, I think, helps us in some way.
Well, it's not so much his lack of intelligence. He's got enough minions out there who are working the machine, and now we're seeing this triumvirate of ideologies which are pushing against the MAGA movement. First, MAGA itself, right? White nationalists, white supremacists backed government to go get your money, right? For white people only. Then you have this, these eliminationist, accelerationist militias out there, the Groypers who are one, and that's going to be my last question about the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And then you have these, technet of the America, tech bros who are talking dark enlightenment theory and managed to, in 5 years, jump themselves to the vice presidency of the United States with a young guy who called, Trump Hitler just 6 years ago, and now is working with the top 4 richest men in the technological world, minus Bill Gates. And those 4 are all South African immigrants. They are all hardcore democratic forces: Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, David Sachs, and Elon Musk. And they are throwing their money around in a way that it just strikes me that while we're thinking of that quaint analogy of Tony Soprano, in North Jersey, and that maybe now Trump is the equivalent of Murder Inc. or, but I'm seeing almost a congealing of all criminal political activity into a national movement that no longer believes any safeguards, breaks, or documents mean if I could sum it all up, Woodrow Wilson was a racist, yay. Richard Nixon was a criminal, yay. Donald Trump is, do I look like I give a fuck? Right? I will do whatever I effing please. And you're right, George III himself had way more constraints. And when he was mad, literally out of his mind for 6 months, things didn't go half as bad as they're going as in America now. And the only reason I'm saying that is I'm feeling the bullets go by, I'm hearing the artillery hit, and I can tell you what's coming down the pike because I am trained to identify bad trends. And I wrote 4 New York Times bestsellers about Trump, and unfortunately, every damn word of them have come true, and everything in them was proved in the Mueller report or beyond. And I kept warning, this is just the beginning. It's going to get boatloads worse. Will we go to 1868, where we have the third rise of the Ku Klux Klan? Possible. Or are we going to go, is an election going to rebalance this or throw us into the Second American Civil War?
Yeah.
That being said,
and I don't agree with any of that analysis or of the threat. And you're certainly correct about the people that he surrounded himself and the cravenness of J.D. Vance and his ambition, which really is to I think partly his wealth, that he wants to rival Putin and how much money he has, and he's willing to use the United States in order to try to achieve that goal. And he has the allies of people who you would hope he would never have, like Mark Zuckerberg, for instance, and others who are failing to stand up to him. And then those who are worse. And we saw Peter Thiel's interview with the New York Times. My God, that was a frightening example of this philosophy, which is so anti-democratic. But I'll just, I know that we're towards the end, so I just want to kind of leave you with this. What I'm trying to do is provide hope, but also to be honest. And I think one way to do that, and this just goes to our spirited conversation, is to go back in time and imagine what it's like in these different moments and what it felt like. And I think it did feel similar. 1798, 1799, the opposition party is being shut down. All of the allies are being prosecuted. There is a plot, by the way, that's uncovered by one of these amazing editors who, and again, the thesis of the book is these citizens fight back, they call out the authoritarian threat, and then they succeed in electing a recovery president. The presidency is the risk, but also is the thing that brings us back. And one of the editors named Dwayne uncovers a plot. You're going to like this. Your listeners are going to like this or not like this. To create a committee in the Senate to deny the certification of electoral votes so that it goes to the House of Representatives, where they're going to vote state by state. And lo and behold, Adams will be elected again, even though he doesn't win the election in 1800. That's the plan. It's exactly the same plan as January 6th. January 6th wasn't a riot. It was a constitutional coup, an attempt to use the instability of the Electoral College to steal the election. That was tried then. What happened to Dwayne? He was prosecuted. So they shift to that. So that's how bad things look at that moment. The guy who uncovers the plot to steal the election is on trial all of a sudden. They tried to try him in the Senate, then they tried him through courts. Or in 1868, before we know the results of the election, as that mass murder is happening, same kind of feeling. Or William Monroe Trotter, in many ways, one of the most important heroes of the book, a newspaper reporter, an activist who worked with Ida B. Wells to confront Woodrow Wilson as he's spreading this, not just segregation of the federal government and the military, but this white supremacist ideology through his textbook and Birth of a Nation, which popularizes that idea. Mm-hmm. He kills himself because he's so convinced that the future of the country is white nationalism. That's how bleak it looks in each of these moments. And so it is bleak. I'm definitely trying to up with you that we're in heated agreement about that. But that, I want listeners to see we're going to come through it. We are not. You have not been silenced. I have not been silenced so far. See where we are next week. And I think that should give us strength.
Well, all I know is that in this current time, I can take some solace that the documentary film that was sent to us from the future called Idiocracy, which showed that President Dwayne Elizondo Mountain Dew Camacho actually has more solid decision making than the present White House by allowing them to grow food. And my only hope is that that we can actually use people power to get enough opposition out there. But I'm part of the No Kings movement. I have my own political action committee, FAFOPAC, and let me tell you something. The apathy level in America right now, to me, is dangerous. I've spoken twice at Auschwitz. The last conference was in 2019 called Never Again. Really? And about the tides of right-wing authoritarianism moving through the world that could result in another genocide. And my problem with how things are going in the United States is I was brought to speak about America. Two people who had survived Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge massacres, Rwanda, the Auschwitz, all of these things. And I kept thinking, I'm in an upside down world and I do not like where this is going. Because if people can see that, some people always say we're in Nazi Germany, 1933. Been to Dachau 4 or 5 times. That's Nazi Germany, 1936, where they were putting priest and opposition figures, not even communist, in there at that point. And when I hear the Attorney General yesterday say that now free speech is now going to, their hate speech and protected speech is now going to be weaponized, that the United States government will bring this down, you and I are going to have to see what our viewership is going to be, or our listenership is going to be like. And I want everyone to go to listen to your podcast, because I need more assurance from people who know the law. Dahlia Lithwick and I had this chat about 2 months ago, and she is convinced the Supreme Court will break every precedent for Donald Trump. And then when a Democratic president comes in, they will break every precedent to ensure that everything that they had decided will be reversed. And which means we're in a free-for-all now. So please, I'll give you one last chance. Give me one bit of hopium. I need it.
We've had Dahlia on. We've also had, representatives from the ACLU who are fighting so many of these fights. Yeah. And what we're facing, I think, is a battle, and there's no question about it. And many of those Nixon-era remnants that we talked about in the unitary executive are exactly at the wrong time, empowering Trump to have control over those great civil servants, many of whom are still there, taking their oath seriously. So there is a battle that's going on, and there have been some victories. There was a victory against the unitary executive in this recent case. Many of them are happening at the Court of Appeals or at the district court level. But we're finding out about stuff. That's part of the point of the litigation, that as the ACLU and other groups find these litigants and we hear about them, my ultimate bet is not on the Supreme Court. It is on some lower courts aiding us in finding out what's happening. Yeah. But it's on the people, that citizens, we have, unlike Nazi Germany, a long history of democracy, of constitutional democracy. I think we were wrongly taught in civics class that the 3 branches of government, Hamilton and the Federalist Papers tell us that'll protect us. That's not how it works. There is no Constitution police. There's us. There's us talking about these things, about the No Kings rally is so important. What a brilliant slogan. No Kings, 2 words that just sum up exactly what we've been talking about. And yeah, I'm not naive, but I'm hopeful that we'll prevail, because we've seen it before. That's what I've been trying to stress to listeners. And we don't ever prevail through courts. We prevail through politics, through mass movements. And we're not seeing it yet, but we're trying to spark it. And we're still somewhat early on. And so that's where my hope comes from. And the podcast is The Oath in the Office. We're hosting partly journalists like Dahlia, but you'll also hear people who are emerging stars, like my classmate from Stanford Law School, Raul Torres, who's the New Mexico Attorney General, who really is crafting a message of how to talk about all this, and also economic needs for individuals. Because after all, some of the Trump supporters aren't fascists. They're people who cared about inflation. And, I have a friend who was telling me how happy he was when Trump won. We had never talked about politics before, and it was that Trump was going to fight inflation. So, those people we were winning back, and that's why, our podcast is all about hope.
That comment reminds me. Now I'm going to bring it back down. That comment reminds me of something I saw in the documentary Shoah decades ago about the Holocaust, and they were interviewing an old Polish woman, and she was talking about how wonderful the Jews were and how the women were beautiful, they were well dressed, and that in the end she's glad they were gone. And the interviewer says, why? And she goes, now we have pigs.
Love it.
So, okay, well,
what
Corey
a
Brettschneider,
conversation, Malcolm. Thank you so much for having me.
it is my pleasure. Your book, The Presidents and the People, I loved what I've read. I'm going to go back over the Nixon part now because you've recalibrated my worldview there, and I might have been too pie in the sky, and I was like 12. So, thanks for coming on to Black Man Spy. I appreciate it.
What a pleasure, Malcolm. Thank you. And if you want to check out our podcast, of course, it's called The Oath in the Office. And Malcolm, I'm hoping you'll be a guest in the near future.
My pleasure.
Great. And I should say, too, it's co-hosted with John Fugelsang, who I know was just on.
Oh, John said last week. All right, take care. That was a fascinating discussion. Just absolutely amazing. Please go get Corey Brettschneider's book, The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. I have it now in Kindle. I read it before this show. I clearly did not pay enough attention to Nixon, but I think we are in a unique moment in history where, Professor Brettschneider is just going to have to write another book just about this period in history. But it's not written. It's the result. The end is not written. We are the end result. And he's right. I haven't been rounded up for violations of freedom of speech, but it's coming. I think we are in a dangerous, dangerous place. And no conspiracy theory here can explain why the Attorney General of the United States yesterday, or by the time you hear this, it'll be a week ago, said that they would now be weaponizing free speech, that hate speech as they saw it, right, which includes criticism of their friends, will now be something that the United States government will go after its citizens over. Absolutely disgusting. As I once said to the famous right-wing blogger, podcaster in, Charlottesville Nazi, Baked Alaska, I defended your right to say any stupid thing you want. Just so long as you don't move into action, I will continue to defend that right. And that goes for everybody else out there. Charlie Kirk was no saint. He was a horrible human being. I have listened to every word that he said. I was horrified that Americans who saw themselves as people of and for the people would have thoughts like this about Blacks, Hispanics, women, and the direction that Christianity would go to. Because as a Christian myself, I have a copy of Jesus's owner's manual, and I know that none of the things he espoused Charlie Kirk believed in or put out into the public sphere. But you know what? He had a right to say it. I defend that he said it, and the terrorist that killed him, who apparently was from the ultra right, had no right to take his life. None whatsoever. And hopefully in next week's Black Man Spy, we're going to have a deeper discussion about this, because this political violence that I wrote about in my last book, They Want to Kill Americans, is starting to get out of control. But we're also starting to see innocent people be blamed for things that are coming from the right and the far right. So with that, remember, subscribe to Black Man Spy on Apple, Stitcher, and wherever your fine podcasts are listed. You can find it on YouTube, mainly on the Black Man Spy podcast. Please subscribe to that so that you can get this every week in your inbox. Most of my long form writing, including the one that I'm writing today and tomorrow, which we're writing about the attacks on democracy and the indicators that show that the assassin for Charlie Kirk came from the ultra extremist Groyper world. I'm going to be doing an intelligence analysis about that. You can find me on at Malcolm Nance, malcolmnance.substack.com, on Blue Sky at malcolmnance.bsky.com, and still on X/Twitter, just to harass my critics. You can find me at Malcolm Nance on there, making fun of people. So thank you again for coming to this week's episode of Black Man Spy. I will see you on the beach.